Some wounds never bleed. They never leave scars. Nobody photographs them. Nobody reports them. Yet they can destroy an entire family. Tonight's story is not about violence. It is not about addiction. It is not about poverty. It is about something far more difficult to see. A child who spent 20 years trying to earn a love that was never freely given. A mother who never realized the damage she was causing. A father who saw the truth and looked away. By the time this story ends, a marriage will collapse. Two brothers will be torn apart. And a family that looked perfect from the outside will never be the same again. This is the story of the Whitmore family. And this is the unspoken chapter. Before we continue, if stories about hidden family wounds, painful truths, and life-changing revelations speak to you, subscribe now. Every week on the Unspoken Chapter, we uncover the stories families tried to keep buried. Now, let's begin. Philadelphia. Chestnut Hill. The kind of neighborhood where the lawns are trimmed, the houses are beautiful, and the people know each other's names. From the outside, the Whitmores looked like a family that had done everything right. A respected husband, a devoted wife, 2 sons, a comfortable home. The kind of family people pointed to and quietly admired. But appearances can be deceiving, because inside that beautiful house lived a wound nobody was willing to name. And the child carrying it would spend most of his life trying to understand why he felt unwanted. Years later, Diane Whitmore would insist she loved both of her sons equally. She believed it. But if that were true, why did one son spend his entire childhood feeling invisible? The answer begins years earlier, long before anyone realized something was wrong. Diane Whitmore was 31 years old when she gave birth to her first son. His name was Malcolm. The delivery was easy. Textbook, the nurses called it. 5 hours of labor. No major complications. And then came the sound that changed everything. A healthy newborn cry. The moment Malcolm was placed on Diane's chest, something shifted inside her. Not just love. Something deeper. A feeling so powerful she couldn't put it into words. As though the entire world had quietly rearranged itself around this tiny human being. Malcolm had his father's eyes. Deep, calm, observant. The kind of eyes that seemed older than the face carrying them. He slept through the night sooner than expected. Smiled earlier than the parenting books predicted. And charmed everyone who met him. At grocery stores, strangers stopped to admire him. At church, people asked to hold him. Gerald Whitmore called him the Little General. Diane had a different name. She called him her miracle. For 3 years, Malcolm remained the center of her world. The answer to every prayer she had carried since childhood. Proof that life was unfolding exactly the way she had hoped. And for a while, it truly seemed perfect. Gerald was a dependable husband. Not a man of many words, but a man of action. He fixed what was broken. Showed up when needed. Worked hard. Came home every evening. And never missed an important moment in Malcolm's life. For 3 years, the Whitmore family looked exactly the way they appeared from the outside. Happy, stable, whole. Then Diane became pregnant again. And everything changed. Almost immediately, she sensed this pregnancy was different. The sickness was worse. The exhaustion felt endless. Doctor appointments became more frequent. And anxiety slowly crept into places confidence used to live. Still, Diane said nothing. She told Gerald she was fine. She told her mother not to worry. She told herself the same thing. But her body was telling a different story. At 34 weeks pregnant, her blood pressure suddenly spiked. Doctors moved quickly, too quickly. One moment she was at home. The next, she was being rushed to Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia. Outside, it was a cold February evening. Inside, fluorescent lights reflected off polished hospital floors. Gerald drove behind the ambulance with both hands gripping the wheel, trying not to imagine the worst. What followed was 39 hours of labor, 39 hours of fear, 39 hours of uncertainty. Doctors spoke in urgent voices, words like preeclampsia, fetal distress, emergency intervention. There were moments when nobody knew how the story would end. Moments when the medical team wasn't sure who they would be able to save. For 6 terrifying minutes, machines breathed for Diane. 6 minutes. Then finally, after nearly 2 days of fighting for survival, a cry echoed through the room. A second son, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, dark hair, tiny fists clenched tight. They named him Caleb. When the nurses placed Caleb on Diane's chest, she smiled. She thanked them. She said all the things a new mother is supposed to say. But beneath the exhaustion, beneath the relief, beneath the gratitude, a dangerous association had already begun to form. Caleb had arrived, and in Diane's mind, so had the most terrifying experience of her life. The doctors assured her the bond would come. The nurses told her she simply needed time, and perhaps they were right. But somewhere deep inside Diane Whitmore, A scar had already begun forming. Quietly, without permission, without words, Caleb had not caused her suffering, but her mind had already connected the two. And that invisible connection would shape the next 20 years of their lives. Neither Diane nor anyone else could see it yet, but the damage had already begun, and soon, the temperature inside the Whitmore home would begin to change. Nobody in the Whitmore house ever said it out loud, not once. There was no family meeting, no confession, no cruel declaration that one child mattered more than the other. But children do not need words. Children notice patterns, and Caleb Whitmore began noticing them long before he could explain them. The atmosphere in the house had two temperatures, one when Malcolm entered a room, and another when Caleb did. When Malcolm came home from school, Diane's face softened. Her voice changed. Her attention followed him naturally. When Caleb came home, there was often a pause, a hesitation so small nobody else would have noticed. But Caleb noticed. Children always do. The difference was never dramatic. That was the problem. There were no screaming matches, no obvious rejection, no moments anyone could point to and call abuse. Just hundreds of tiny moments that slowly became a message Caleb absorbed year after year. You are not chosen. When Malcolm brought home an excellent report card, it went on the refrigerator. There were hugs, photos, pride. When Caleb brought home the same grades, Diane smiled politely. Good job. And that was usually the end of it. Neither response seemed cruel. Yet together they created a reality. One son felt celebrated, the other felt tolerated. Gerald noticed. The first time it truly struck him, Caleb was 4 years old. One evening he walked downstairs and found Diane reading on the couch. Malcolm sat curled against her side, her arm wrapped around him, a storybook resting in her lap. The scene looked beautiful until Gerald saw Caleb, standing silently in the doorway, watching, waiting, hoping someone would invite him in. Nobody did. Gerald crossed the room, picked Caleb up, and carried him upstairs. That night he read 2 stories instead of 1, then sat beside Caleb's bed long after the boy had fallen asleep, listening to him breathe, feeling something he couldn't quite name, a helplessness that settled deep inside his chest. Because for the first time, he realized something was wrong, and he had no idea how to fix it. Over the years, Gerald tried. He really did. He approached Diane gently, carefully, as though every sentence was walking across thin ice. I think Caleb needs more from you. Diane looked genuinely confused. What do you mean? He seems distant. I love both boys equally. And the frightening part was, she believed it, completely. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't lying. She truly believed she was treating both children the same. That made the problem harder to solve. Because people rarely fix wounds they cannot see. Years passed, the gap widened, and by the time the boys were 7 and 10, Gerald's concern had become impossible to ignore. That was when he reached out for help. A marriage counselor named Dr. Patricia Hale, an experienced therapist with an office near Rittenhouse Square. By the second session, Dr. Hale noticed what Gerald had been seeing for years. By the third session, she said something that changed the room. Diane, it is possible to love your child and still be emotionally unavailable to them because of unresolved trauma. The room went silent. Dr. Hale continued. It is possible to provide food, safety, and stability while withholding something just as important, the certainty that a child is wanted. For a moment, Diane said nothing. She looked down. Then she nodded politely. Thanked Dr. Hale, and never returned. Gerald would replay that moment in his mind, because what happened next would prove something terrifying. The warning had been given. The truth had been named. The damage could still have been stopped. But sometimes the most devastating family tragedies happen after the truth has already been revealed. Gerald wanted peace. Diane wanted normalcy. And Caleb paid the price for both. By 14, Caleb had learned something no child should ever learn. Love was conditional, at least in his house. Love belonged to Malcolm. Approval belonged to Malcolm. Pride belonged to Malcolm. And no matter how hard Caleb tried, he could never quite reach them. Malcolm excelled at everything: sports, academics, church, community events. People loved him. Teachers praised him. Neighbors admired him. And none of that was Malcolm's fault. But every achievement felt like another reminder of what Caleb was not. So eventually, he stopped trying. He stopped bringing home good news. Stopped seeking approval. Stopped expecting warmth. Because disappointment hurts less when you stop hoping. And that decision would change everything. He began spending more time away from home. At first it was harmless. Friends, basketball courts, neighborhood hangouts, places where nobody compared him to Malcolm, places where he felt seen. Gerald noticed the shift, and once again he tried. Father-son breakfasts, football games, Morning drives to school, any excuse to spend time together. Caleb appreciated it. He loved his father. But there was something Gerald didn't fully understand. A father's love cannot always heal a wound created by a mother's absence. Those are different injuries, and they require different kinds of healing. By 16, Caleb was drifting. By 17, he was skipping school regularly. Then came the phone call, a fight outside a gas station, police involvement. Nothing major, nothing life-altering, but serious enough for Gerald to spend a Thursday night sitting inside a precinct, watching his son stare silently at the floor, not angry, not emotional, just empty, and that frightened Gerald more than anything else. On the drive home, neither spoke. When they entered the house, Diane was waiting in the kitchen. She looked at Caleb, then looked at Gerald, and quietly said the sentence that neither of them would ever forget. "I always knew he was going to be a problem." The room froze. For a second, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Gerald stared at his wife, and for the first time in 17 years of marriage, he had absolutely nothing to say. What neither parent realized was that something had finally broken inside Caleb. Not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. And within 3 years, the consequences would tear the Whitmore family apart. The final fracture began the year Caleb turned 20. By then, Malcolm Whitmore had become everything his family hoped he would be. Honor student, college graduate, respected, disciplined, successful. The kind of young man parents proudly introduced to strangers. That summer, Malcolm was accepted into a prestigious master's program. The Whitmores organized a celebration dinner in Old City, Philadelphia. Family members came from neighboring towns. Church friends attended. Former teachers stopped by. The restaurant buzzed with laughter and admiration. For Diane, it felt like validation, proof that all her sacrifices had been worth it. As the evening unfolded, she stood to give a speech. The room fell silent. She spoke about faith, about perseverance, about motherhood, and then she looked toward Malcolm. Tears filled her eyes. "I always knew you were destined for something special." Applause erupted across the room. People smiled. Glasses were raised. Cameras flashed. At the far end of the table sat Caleb, quiet, polite, almost invisible. He clapped when everyone else clapped, smiled when someone looked his way, said all the right things. Inside, however, something was happening, something years in the making. Because while everyone celebrated Malcolm's future, nobody noticed the son who had spent 20 years searching for a place inside the same family. Nobody asked what Caleb was feeling. Nobody wondered why he had become so quiet. Nobody realized they were watching the final chapter unfold. On the drive home, Gerald glanced toward his son. "You okay?" Caleb looked out the window. The city lights reflected across the glass. "I'm fine." It was a lie. And both of them knew it. 2 weeks later, Caleb disappeared. No screaming argument, no dramatic confrontation, no final attempt to be understood. He simply packed his belongings, left the house, and never came back. But before leaving, he left something behind. A single note, one paragraph, a lifetime of pain condensed into a few sentences. Gerald found it first. He stood alone in Caleb's room, looking around, the chessboard they used to play together. An old Eagles poster, the bed, the dresser, the silence. Then his eyes found the folded paper. His hands trembled as he opened it. The note read, "I spent 20 years trying to earn something you decided long ago I didn't deserve. I'm done trying. I love Dad. I'm sorry I was never what you needed, Mom." Gerald read it once, then again, then a third time. Each reading felt heavier than the last, because deep down, he knew every word was true. He carried the note downstairs. Diane sat in the living room watching television. A normal evening, a normal house, a normal life. At least that's what it looked like. Gerald placed the note beside her, said nothing, watched her read. The room remained silent. Seconds felt like minutes. For the first time in years, Diane looked uncertain. Not defensive, not angry, just uncertain. As though a truth she had spent decades avoiding had finally found its way into the room. Gerald stood there, 22 years of excuses. 22 years of hoping things would somehow fix themselves. 22 years of watching one son slowly disappear. And finally, he said the words he should have said years earlier. "This is what you did." The sentence landed like a hammer, not because it was loud, but because it was true. 3 months later, Gerald moved out. The marriage ended quietly. No scandal, no affair, no betrayal. Just the accumulated weight of years. Years of ignored warnings, years of unspoken pain, years of pretending everything was fine. The Whitmore family didn't collapse all at once. It collapsed one unnoticed moment at a time. One colder greeting, one missed hug, one comparison, one silence. Until eventually there was nothing left holding it together. For Malcolm, the fallout was devastating. He had spent his entire life believing he belonged to a healthy family. Now he was forced to confront a reality he never wanted to see. He withdrew, delayed parts of his graduate studies, began questioning memories he once viewed as normal. Moments he now understood differently, moments that suddenly carried new meaning. And Diane, for the first time in decades, she was alone. The same beautiful house, the same carefully arranged furniture, the same neighborhood, the same church, the same routines. Yet everything felt different, because the silence she once mistook for peace had finally revealed itself. It wasn't peace, it was emptiness, and emptiness has a way of echoing, especially when it contains 20 years of regret. Now let's step outside the Whitmore story for a moment, because this isn't really about one family, it's about millions. Families that look healthy from the outside. Families carrying wounds nobody talks about. Families where favoritism hides beneath ordinary routines. The truth is uncomfortable, but it needs to be said. Many parents believe they treat their children equally. Many genuinely mean to. Yet children experience love through actions, through attention, through tone, through consistency, not intentions, and when those experiences differ long enough, children notice. The favored child notices. The overlooked child notices. The entire family adapts around it. The favored child often carries invisible pressure. Pressure to succeed. Pressure to remain exceptional. Pressure to justify why they were chosen. The overlooked child carries something different. A question. A question that follows them into adulthood. What was wrong with me? For some, that question becomes fuel. They become high achievers. Perfectionists. People who spend their lives trying to prove their worth. Others move in the opposite direction. They stop trying, stop believing, stop expecting love altogether. Different paths, same wound. What Diane never understood was that her trauma was real. The fear she experienced during Caleb's birth was real. The suffering was real. The terror was real. But Caleb did not create that suffering. He was simply born into it. And because she never confronted the trauma, it quietly shaped how she saw him, year after year, until neither of them could escape its consequences. Gerald's failure was different. He saw the problem. He recognized it. He even spoke about it several times. But eventually he chose comfort over confrontation and silence over action. That decision cost him dearly, because witnessing injustice and doing nothing rarely preserves peace. It only postpones the damage. Years later, Caleb built a life in another city. Not a perfect life, but a healthier one. He began therapy, built meaningful friendships, learned slowly that love did not have to be earned. Gerald called him every Sunday, without fail. Malcolm eventually reached out, not with a text message, not with an email, but with a handwritten letter, 2 pages long. The first sentence read, "I always knew something felt wrong. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it," Caleb replied. Healing wasn't immediate. Relationships rarely work that way. But for the first time, the door was open. And sometimes that's where healing begins. Not with forgiveness, not with reconciliation, simply with a door opening, a willingness to tell the truth, and the courage to finally walk through it. Before we end this chapter, I want to speak directly to you. Not as a storyteller, not as a narrator, but as someone who knows there are people listening right now who saw themselves somewhere in this story. Maybe you were Caleb. Maybe you grew up in a house where the temperature changed when you walked into a room. Maybe you spent years wondering why approval came so easily to someone else but never seemed to reach you. Maybe you became the overachiever, the people pleaser, the perfectionist, always chasing the next accomplishment, the next promotion, the next relationship, the next reason for someone to finally say, "You are enough." Or maybe you stopped trying altogether. Maybe disappointment became so familiar that hope started to feel dangerous. So you learned to expect less, to need less, to stay quiet. Because quiet hurt less than rejection. If that's you, hear this. The way someone treated you is not a measurement of your worth. A child does not determine their value by how loudly they are loved. And a parent's inability to give what a child needs does not mean the child deserved less. Sometimes the coldness we experience from others has very little to do with us. Sometimes it begins long before we arrive. Sometimes we inherit wounds we never created and spend years believing they belong to us. They don't. The truth is, children are not responsible for healing their parents' unresolved pain. Children are not responsible for earning affection. Children are not responsible for proving they deserve love. Love was supposed to be given freely, from the very beginning. And if you never received that, the absence was real, the wound was real, the loneliness was real. But the verdict you carried from it was never true. You were never the problem. You were simply standing in the path of a pain that started long before you got there. And for those listening as parents, there is something important I hope you take from this story. Not guilt, not shame, awareness, because shame rarely changes anyone. But awareness can. Ask yourself a difficult question, not the comfortable version, the honest version. Do all of my children feel equally seen, equally heard, equally valued? Or is one of them working harder for my attention than the others? If that question makes you uncomfortable, don't run from it. Sit with it. Because sometimes growth begins where comfort ends. And if there is unresolved pain in your life, pain from loss, trauma, fear, or experiences you never fully processed, please remember this. Your children should never become the storage place for wounds you have not healed. Those wounds deserve attention. They deserve honesty. And sometimes they deserve professional help, because every unhealed wound eventually reaches beyond the person carrying it. Sometimes it reaches into an entire family. The most powerful words a parent can ever say are often the simplest. I was wrong. I see it now. I'm sorry. Those words cannot erase the past, but they can change the future. And sometimes they can reopen doors everyone thought were permanently closed. As for the Whitmores, their story remains unfinished, like so many family stories do. Some wounds heal, some scars remain, some conversations happen, others never do. But one truth remains. The things families refuse to talk about rarely disappear. They simply grow louder in silence. And that is why we tell these stories. Because somewhere out there, someone is carrying a burden they have never put into words. Someone is still standing in that doorway, still waiting to be invited in, still wondering whether they mattered. Maybe this chapter helped answer that question. Maybe it helped you understand someone else. Or maybe it simply reminded you that hidden wounds are often the deepest ones. Before you go, I want to ask you one question. Have you ever felt like the forgotten child in your family? Or have you witnessed favoritism between siblings? Tell us in the comments. You can share your story. Or simply write, I felt this. Because sometimes a few words can remind someone they are not alone. And if this chapter spoke to you, subscribe to the Unspoken chapter. Every week, we uncover another story hidden behind closed doors. Another truth nobody wanted spoken aloud. Another chapter waiting to be told. Until next time, remember this, silence does not heal a wound. It only gives it more time to grow. And every family has a story. Some are told. Others remain hidden. This has been the Unspoken chapter.